And that's down, and then and that's.
All right, you guys can go right here, and I'll do.
Oh my God! Hi guys.
We've been chatting.
You guys went to high school together.
Yeah, we did.
Weird.
Wow.
Turn this off.
That's dedication.
You and Joe.
I love that we have so many friends here tonight. So I'm just going to do a very quick intro, and then we'll get the show on the road. My name's Beth. I'm with Alta Magazine.
Woohoo!
And I'm really excited to help. Alta is really excited to help present David Ulin discussing his very exciting new collection, Joan Didion, the 1960s and 70s. David is the author and editor of 10 books and the recipient of awards and fellowships too numerous to mention. I edited that so it's down. He's a former books editor and book critic of the Los Angeles Times, teaches at USC, and he is the books editor of our magazine, Alta. Please note our cover. This is Joan Didion. And in fact, in this book, it's our special fall guide where we dramatically expand our books coverage, including 28 titles, with an excerpt of David's new book. And so David has put this beautiful literary section of our magazine together. He's really expanding our literary coverage. Take your Alta home tonight. Subscribe to our newsletter. Find us on Twitter. Go to our website. I'm here to pitch that hard. And then I'm going to shut up about it. Carol Edgarian will be in conversation with David tonight. She is an author, editor, and publisher. Her novels include the bestseller 3 Stages of Amazement, which is right here, as well as Rise the Euphrates. Her articles and essays have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, NPR, W, among others, and she is the co-founder and editor of Narrative, a leading digital publisher of fiction, poetry, interviews, and art. Please take your Alta. And a big thanks to our book partner, Books Inc. Both David and Carol's books are on sale here tonight. So support these authors, support independent bookstores, and buy some books tonight. David and Carol, take it away.
Thank you, Beth.
There you go. Hello, you.
Hey, how's it going?
Well,
We're pretending we haven't actually been talking in the back, but we have been.
we're pretending we haven't known each other for.
Oh, we don't have to pretend about that. We've known each other for a good 70% of our lives, probably, right? Since we were children. Actually, seriously, since we were children.
Yeah.
Well, high school
years.
children, yeah.
5 or 6 years.
Did you go to school together?
We went to high school together.
We did.
We did. So I think just to kick things off, talk about how you got involved with this project. Like why Didion? Why you? What did you do to make this book be this lovely book that it is?
Good question. Okay, so as with most things, it's in large measure is kind of being in the right place at the right time. I'll start with, so Didion, for me, it's really interesting to do this in San Francisco because this is where I discovered.
Turn.
I should stand towards you this way?
No, but toward them, yeah, like that.
Everybody can see? Yeah.
Hello, David.
All right, so I was introduced to Didion when I was living in San Francisco, living on the Haight in the spring of 1980. My mother, I grew up in New York. My mother was concerned that I wasn't coming back. And so she called me one afternoon and said, I have a book for you to read. It's called Slouching Towards Bethlehem. You should read the essay about Haight-Ashbury. And I did. This is actually quite strange because my mother, although she was at one point in her life an English teacher, has never been, like, this is the only book I think she ever recommended that I read. And so it's all her fault. And you know, I think she was trying to dissuade my countercultural tendencies, which she did and she didn't, or maybe they weren't as pronounced as she thought they were. But what she inadvertently did was introduce me to this writer. And so and I had never thought about, I had wanted to be a writer since I was a little kid, but I had never thought about nonfiction as a literary pursuit. It just had never occurred to me. And reading the essays in Slouching Towards Bethlehem, I was like, I want to do this. What attracted me to them was both their high, the sort of the language and their kind of persona, and the high sort of literary quality of the writing, but also that they were about the world that I was living in, that they weren't, they were interior in their way, but they were about that interior consciousness interacting with the external landscape of the world and the culture, all of which were things I was spending a lot of time thinking about and reading about. And it was the first time I'd really seen someone meld those two strains. Afterwards, I got turned on to other writers, Michael Hare, Baldwin, etc., who did that. But Didion was really the gateway into thinking about that territory of literary production. And so I, basically became an essayist in a very fundamental way because of the influence of that book and also the White Album, which I read back to back and still kind of think of as one long book. So over the years, one of the great things about my job as a book reviewer and book editor was that I've been able to meet pretty much all of my literary heroes or role models or influences who weren't dead by the time I got to talk to them. So at a certain point, I got to interview her when Your Magical Thinking came out.
Oh, great.
And got to know her a little bit, and have interviewed her a number of times over the course of the years. So that's sort of the Didion background. I wouldn't say we're like friends, but we got to know each other a bit. And this book grew partly out of that, and I've written a lot about her, taught her, thought about her, but partly also out of the Editors Library of America and I got to know each other because I did a book with them about 17 years ago called Writing Los Angeles, an anthology of Los Angeles literature. And about 5 or 6 years ago, we were talking about, I was in New York, we were having coffee, and one of them said, what would be your dream project? And I said, let's do Didion. Here's how I would do it. And he said, write a proposal, we'll see what's what. So I wrote the proposal. This has got to be like 2014, 2015. And as with most of these things, we talked about it for a while and then nothing really happened and it kind of got backburnered. And then it literally fell off the burner to the point where, no lie, I had forgotten entirely about it until I got an email last August of 18, out of the blue from this editor saying, are you still interested? Because we've negotiated the deal. And, and I said, yeah, let's do it. So it was one of these things where it was a kind of intense process for a while, and then it kind of fell completely off the table, and then it got dropped into my lap in an unexpected way, and there was no way I wasn't going to do it, so it required a lot of juggling in terms of figuring out how to do it, because the other idea was once we decided we were going to do it, we wanted to do it, we wanted to get it started pretty quickly.
So always the idea was 3 volumes staggered.
Always the idea, because they wanted to do the complete body of work. They are, we can talk about what the literary canon means or doesn't mean. I'm wildly suspicious of that as a concept, but they are
certainly in flux.
They are canonical in their way. So with writers like this, they don't always do full careers, but they often do full careers. So the writer of Didion's stature, they wanted to do the full career. So one of the discussions was interesting creative discussion was how do we break it down? Do we want to do it chronologically? Do we want to do it fiction and nonfiction? Do we want to do it thematically? There are a lot of different ways to go through her career and look at it. And ultimately, we decided to do it chronologically, both because that's sort of their preferred MO, but also in her case, and we can talk about this too, looking at the work chronologically is really interesting and at least for me, in unexpected ways. I've been reading this work for almost 40 years, and looking at it chronologically opened up connections that I sort of maybe knew on a subterranean level were there, but I wasn't consciously aware of in the same way that I might have been.
Yeah, I can't imagine not reading her chronologically.
Yeah, because because so much of she's ultimately in conversation with herself so much through the pieces. Always, and I think stylistically as well as content-wise, and yeah.
So it would have been very well. I suppose the rationale of breaking it up, nonfiction, fiction, but I'm glad you didn't.
Yeah, the novels talk. It's interesting. The novels are. I think we definitely think about her primarily as a nonfiction writer. The bulk of the work is nonfiction. I think the most sort of iconic work is nonfiction, probably. Of the novels, the novel that people most zero in on is Play It As It Lays. But Played as It Lays doesn't exist without Slouching Towards Bethlehem in terms of the kind of atomized style that she's working in, that kind of, you know, the use of fragments, the sort of collapse of a kind of traditional narrative structure. If you compare Played as It Lays, for instance, with Run River, which is her first novel and first book, which is a book I actually quite like, that's a very traditionally told story in its way. And then Played as It Lays, you get to Played as It Lays, and all of a sudden you've got these chapters that are like, you know, one sentence long,
Right.
you know, and that is definitely something that comes out of the experience, I think, both of living through the 60s and the atomization of the period, but also trying to figure out how to write about that period and the kind of how to write about narrative breakdown. How to use narrative to write about narrative breakdown.
Didion's attempt to, well, also, you know, I wouldn't want to say, I mean, I hate when people say, you know, especially a writer of her stature, do you prefer the nonfiction or the fiction? Because everything is everything. On the other hand, the nonfiction, I think, is so much stronger because she was,
I'm sorry.
it's okay. There she is.
She's smiling in.
She didn't like that idea. But also, I think she was always her best character.
She is, I mean, you know, no question, right?
You
And,
know,
I mean,
and as she's evolved, I mean, you know, I was thinking, and we talked a little bit about this, about what we each learned from Didion. And when I think about, I mean, for me, it began with Slouching Toward Bethlehem also, but Goodbye to All That. I remember reading that. I was 23, I was living alone, and didn't know, I was trying to make my way as a newbie writer, and I didn't necessarily even know where the rent was coming the next month. And I sat down to read that piece, and I cried and cried and cried. I mean, she was talking right to me. But even then, she had that kind of distance where she was both the girl living through the dreams of New York, and a privileged girl, mind you. But you know, I love how I could still remember the Bonwood teller and charging her dinner at Bloomingdale's, and of course the incredible gold silk curtains.
yeah.
You know, that she didn't sew right, or they weren't weighted at the bottom, so
they billowed.
So they billowed out and got all the schmutz from New York City on them, all and the rain.
And the rain,
And there's that kind of excess
yeah.
of Didion, and the kind of carelessness that is so intentional when she puts it in the piece.
Well,
right?
it's got that double vision. Well, there's two things, right? One is that in that piece where she says, you know, we could actually look up the quote, but I won't. But there, towards the end, you know, that was the year I realized everything counted, all of it, right? You know,
it was all irrevocable.
Yeah, and there's something really interesting about that moment of revelation, which also happened for me. Probably she's 28, I think, in that essay. That's around the time I was like, oh, right, you know, all that stuff, like time is like, I'm not getting that time back, you know, and right, every decision.
It's only a 20-something-year-old can think profoundly.
Right, and every decision I make, it's another decision I'm not going to make. But so there's that. So she's existing in that essay as the character, as the 28-year-old, but she's writing that essay. I mean, she's not that much older when she's writing that essay, but she's in her 30s. But she's writing that essay from the point of view of someone looking back at the 20-something-year-old who's living through that.
And that's the amazing part, is that ability she had from the get-go to both be this evolving, hapless, depressed, you know, fill-in-the-blank character, but to have the coolness of the narrative voice that is observing it all, knows it all, can see around it, can talk directly to her reader. And
the essay allows her, the essay as a form is built that way, right? So there is one novel, my favorite of all of her novels, which is not in this book, is Democracy, which is a 1984 novel where the narrator of the novel is a journalist named Joan Didion, who is reporting on these characters who are people she knows, and she's kind of, so it's a way for Didion of kind of having it both ways and kind of building that character, that observer, into the book as a figure, not just as, you know, because as you're right, in the novels, most of the novels, she's got to be recessed. But I think the essay, and this was the thing that really attracted me to it as a form, is it's a form based on that double vision. So you have the narrator operates as the character, because, or the first person character, let's say. The first person is there as the character because that first person narrator is moving through the material and is acting. But the narrator is also the observer who's observing from a different point of view their earlier self behaving and commenting on that behavior. And it's a move that Didion is kind of naturally suited to
Right,
make.
and pulling all the threads.
Yeah.
So where there's revelation, it's both organic in the moment, but it's absolutely Didion working
Well,
all the levers. And
if you look at, say, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, the Haight-Ashbury essay, right? So there's that famous moment at the end where she's got a guy who's taken her through Haight-Ashbury and showing her things. And he comes to where she's staying one morning and says, "There's something you got to see." And he takes her to a house where there's a 5-year-old girl on acid. And she doesn't know,
wearing white lipstick,
right? And there's that great description where that 5-year-old girl is just like any other. She likes going to the beach and Pepsi Cola, and then Bob from the Grateful Dead and Marty from the Jefferson Airplane, and there's this way. But she's sitting there on literally on drugs, this child, and there's and Didion falters. It's the only moment I can think of in her work, certainly in her nonfiction, where that narrative voice falters. She doesn't know what to say. But at the same time, I'm also aware that is a narrative strategy that the author is enacting, right? It's not the writer isn't faltering, the character is faltering, and there's that extreme understanding of the difference between
and the
writer and
character's
character.
faltering for effect.
The character's faltering for effect because we're like, holy shit.
Yeah.
Right? Sorry, but that's what I said. The first time I read that,
We were like, what?
I was like, what?
Criminy.
Actually, it was far worse, right? Anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like
Right.
that moment, and that moment absolutely, for what Didion, for the take on Haight-Ashbury that Didion is writing, that moment absolutely has to be in this essay, and it absolutely has to be that moment that the essay builds to. And it absolutely has to be a moment in which all of the adult character, or the responsible adult character, let's say, in that scene has nothing to say. So it's just the register of it, the pacing of it, the construction of it. It's a remarkable scene, but remarkable maybe most because of how she is using her own character for effect, for narrative effect. How the writer is using the character of, right? How Didion the writer is using Didion the character in that scene.
Right. Right. I mean, so much of her work, and I thought it'd be fun to talk about this. So much of her work, and in terms of, looking at it as we were coming up and thinking about what we wanted to write about and didn't want to write about. For me, so much of her power is in what she doesn't put on the page, in what she withholds. Yeah. Sometimes maddeningly.
Yeah.
And I remember early on, like so many, and more as she's aged, I think that becomes like the Year of Magical Thinking. If you read that book, it's a lot of its horror is what she didn't put on the page. So what's there has a kind of a weightedness and sort of a fractured quality that gives heightened tension to what she went through. And of course, one of the biggest things she doesn't mention in that book is losing her daughter.
Right. Well,
it happened after.
It happened after the book was written, but before the book came out, and she refused, which is just because she's also ruthless, which is one of the best things about her. But she refused to change the book because the book wasn't about that.
That's right.
And so she deals with her daughter's death in the play, which we're also including in the third volume. We're going to have the book and the play.
Oh, that'll be great.
And she also obviously deals with her daughter in Blue Nights, which will also be in that third volume. So there'll be that whole, The play is a really interesting document in the sense that it's kind of in between. It's certainly based on Year of Magical Thinking, but the death of the daughter gets written into it. And so it kind of builds off of the book and then leads into Blue Nights.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great to watch all of that unfold. So Let's play a game.
Okay.
So,
Isn't that what we're doing?
yeah, we are. So, thinking about Didion's work, well, let's say you've posited both Didion's work and Didion as character.
Okay.
Words to describe her. Words to describe it and her.
I think.
And we should have this be an interactive moment.
Yeah, we can open it up to the floor.
Okay.
I would use the word ruthless generally
I would absolutely use the
speaking.
word
Certainly in terms of voice and style and sensibility. You know, her as a character, I think comes off as less ruthless or.
Do you think so?
But no, I think she's pretty ruthless. Yeah, I guess her as a character is pretty ruthless. But ruthless is a word that comes up. I think. I think you've hit on a couple of, that distance, that cool distance or cool ironic distance in a certain way. And I also think of her, the phrase that I often use in regard to her is inner weather. Because I think that one of the great misconceptions about Didion is that we think that she's writing about California, but really she's writing about herself. As all writers do. That is not a criticism, right? I was once trying to write a book and I couldn't figure it out, and in the middle of the night I got this, I figured it out, and in the morning at breakfast I said to my wife, I figured out the book. I won't say what it's about. I said it's not about, I will say it was a book I was going to write about the punk band The Clash. I ended up never writing the book. But I was going to write this book and I couldn't figure out how to approach it, and finally I got it, and what I said was, it's not about The Clash. It's about what The Clash means to me.
Well,
and I think that's what writing is always about. But we think about Didion in this way as the chronicler of the 60s or the chronicler of California, partly, in fact, I think, because she was in many ways the one California writer that New York editors knew, and so she became a national voice of California. I think she's a very significant voice of California, but she was in the right place at the right time. The editors didn't want to work that hard, and she was delivering the goods, so they could just rely on her in that way. But what she's really writing about is her own internal weather, her own internal psychology, which is, which is another point of intersection for her and me, which is essentially a psychology based on existential dread. And there's something really potent about, for me at least, there's something really potent about existential dread. I think about the moment in the White Album where she talks about the little homily that's on her mother-in-law's wall in West Hartford, bless this house, whatever. And she's like, I never could look at that thing because it was I always thought of it as the detail the reporters would write about the morning the bodies were found. And I was like, oh, my people, I have found you, But that's like that idea of, what's the little detail that seems completely innocuous, but is going to be the first line of the true crime book about your murder. That's the, that sensibility. That's all Didion, right? All those famous phrases, prickly dread and whatever, but I think that's really where she's coming from, that kind of neurotic anxiety. And as an anxious neurotic myself, I bonded heavily with her on that.
Well, she plays the neurotic piano.
Yeah,
right?
But I think she really is neurotic. But yes, she certainly plays the neurotic piano and uses it as that's the character.
It's funny. I didn't realize I forgot about West Hartford. That's where I'm from.
Yeah, West Hartford. That's where Dunn was from.
So I'm not sure we got far enough on description. Anybody have a word? The privilege, I would say.
Privilege, certainly.
Depressed, I would say. I thought
aloof. Aloof.
She's you said cool. There's cool, cold. There's also that distance.
Mm-hmm.
That
knowing, right? I mean, for me, the cool comes in the knowing. There's a way that she seems to, again, I think this is on the page. I mean, I'm not saying it's not true in life, but on the page, and we all, about, like, you create that persona on the page, you put in a lot of information that you researched and found, and you drop onto the page as if you just kind of knew it, right? So that persona of knowingness, of knowing, those names she drops, in a lot of the essays are not necessarily the names of famous people. Sometimes they are, but they're often the names of, like, real estate developers or business tycoons or shipping magnates or cruise lines or whatever. The Lurleen, which is the ship that goes went from San Francisco to Honolulu. She drops those things in as if everyone should know it. There's a way that she uses those
she brings
specifics.
us into the party,
Totally,
right?
right.
And brings us into the moment. And a lot of it, and this has been used and overused, is she brings in sort of the name brands of the world to give us a sense of class, to give us a sense of geography, to give us a sense of time.
Yeah. But that was one of the things when I was first reading her that really drew me, because that specificity, both as a tool for a writer, because I was reading her even at that young age as a writer, trying to figure out what she was doing so I could figure out how I could do something like that. But that specificity creates that world that she's operating in, and so it gives her narrative voice a sense of, again, of knowingness. And I think for me that's where the cool comes from. I always thought people who knew stuff were way cooler than people who don't, and history is bearing me out, but current events certainly.
Well, she claims whatever she's writing is her. She claims it as her turf and makes it her turf, even as she's going on a journey of discovery. Right. But I think geography is so essential to who she is, and this scrappy girl from Sacramento, from the Valley, from the not sexy part, the not Beverly Hills, the not Bonwiteller of New York. So there's also that country girl come up quality to her.
No question.
That I don't think she ever really loses.
No, and she's also, I think this is probably true of her personally too, but again, we are talking about the construction of character, the construction of image on the page, which is something that is at the heart of a lot of her work and something she's exceptionally good at. But there's also that sense of her being an outsider. So if we think about her as the chronicler of the 1960s, she's not the chronicler of 1960s in the sense of, say, Ken Kesey, who is like neck deep in the party, right? She's the chronicler of the 1960s, and particularly the countercultural 1960s, from the point of view of someone who, this is absolutely true, in 1962 flew back to California from New York to vote against Richard Nixon in the Republican primary for governor because Richard Nixon was insufficiently conservative. So that's about as outside a take on Haight-Ashbury or the radical left of the 60s or the Panthers or any of the things that she writes about.
I even love this photo. There she is with is it the Hermes scarf, right? I mean, look at her.
In the panhandle,
she's got the little
in the panhandle,
deal going on.
Summer of Love. Yeah.
And looking very sort of scrubbed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And she was, she was, when she reported that story, she was 33, 34. So, even if we go with the cliche of don't trust anybody over 30, she was not one of them.
No.
She didn't want to be one of them. She was observing from the outside, and her conclusions about the counterculture, and particularly her conclusions about the hate in the Summer of Love, have everything to do with having grown up in Sacramento in the 30s and 40s, and having been a sorority girl at Berkeley in the 50s, and all of that kind of stuff. Like that's where that sensibility is coming from. And so so again, I think that distance is encoded in that, but the distance also allows her to kind of develop that I think distance. There's a coolness to that distance because she's not she's not writing about it from the inside as an enthusiast. She's writing about it from the outside as an observer.
Yeah, but it's also, I would add to our list is a fragility.
Oh, no question.
And the fragility is such that she keeps kind of this eggshell around the story and around herself as a character. Mm-hmm. And getting back to what you're saying, writing is always about character. Yeah. There's no getting around it. If you think of any of the greats, if you've read them, you know them. You can't, at a certain point, the writing can't ever be separate from the character of the writer, because it always permeates, it always comes through, because what are you worried about? What are you excited about? Who are you? And in Didion's case, I think as strongly as maybe Virginia Woolf, her body is so much a part of her work. Mm-hmm. Who she is. Have you all ever seen her? She is a ray. She's a ray of a person. And there is that sort of eggshell quality to her that she looks as if she could break. It's deceptive because I think she's
Pretty
oxen.
darn tough.
She's oxen underneath it.
My only advantage as a reporter is that I am so physically small, so temperamentally unobtrusive, and so neurotically inarticulate that people tend to forget that my presence runs counter to their best interests, and it always does.
Oh, that's great.
That's it, right? That's the journalist
That's it.
credo right there.
That's it.
You know,
That's
I think
it.
about that, and Janet Malcolm's line about any journalist who's being honest will tell you that what they do for a living is morally indefensible. And they're basically saying the same thing, which is like, you let me into your house, all bets are off. And there's something really powerful about that. And I think there is, like, you know, even in the pieces where she's not present, she's present. Right, so you look at, say, Some Dreamers a Golden Dream, which is the piece about the San Bernardino murder, the dentist, Lucille Miller, who killed her husband, or was convicted of killing her husband. Clearly, from some of the descriptions, Didion's in the living room, right? Didion's like in the living room when the cops come, but she doesn't put herself in, she doesn't write the scene in first person, but there's so much detail that you know she's observing it. And so there's something really interesting about the way that even when she's not present as a first-person character, she's present. Her observer's eye is present and separate in some way from the story that she's observing.
Yeah, and that separateness is both what is so compelling about her and also drives me crazy. Yeah?
Yeah. I mean, I think it doesn't drive me crazy, but I understand why it drives everybody else crazy. That kind of separateness, because I tend to, I don't know. It doesn't. It's so much a part of who she is and what that voice is that.
Well, it drives me crazy that I keep turning the page because you want the connect. You want to see where sort of the blood is on the page.
Yeah, although I would say, let's see, this is a good point. I would say that we see the blood. It goes back to what you were saying about what's not there, about what she leaves out, about what's not there. I think we see the blood in that way. We watch her, particularly in the nonfiction, and in some ways, even in the, more to the point in the late books, we see her trying not to reveal her vulnerability, and in trying not to reveal her vulnerability, she completely reveals her vulnerability. And there's something really interesting about that move, right? Again, we're talking partly with her of image construction,
right?
But image construction also always has cracks, and so that's one of the driving tensions of the writing between the image that is being constructed through the kind of language and also the way that the image is ultimately going to collapse.
Yeah, and it becomes more brittle.
Yeah.
It becomes more brittle. I think she's actually more comfortable with her vulnerabilities in the early work
Yeah.
than in the later work.
Yeah. Because she's,
Which is interesting.
Well, I think she's younger, and I think she's also not focusing on herself in the same way. I mean, I go back to that question of, their presence in my presence always runs counter to their best interests.
Yeah.
The same might well be said of her presence in terms of her own best interests in the later books where she's writing about her own life, right? And so that
it's easy to see the beginning of things and harder to see the ends.
Yeah.
So think about that line written 67, 68,
something like that, yeah.
And what we're saying about her work in the early days and her work later on. It's easier to see the beginning of things and harder to see the ends.
Yeah.
And I think that is actually a definitive line about Didion's work.
No question. Yeah. I mean, I think it's about her sensibility and then the work that grows out of that sensibility.
Is she relevant still?
I think she's relevant in a couple reasons. I think yes and no. I think she's relevant in a couple of ways. I think in the first place, I think that art is always relevant for its art, right? The level, the perceptions, the language. All, for me in particular, all of the questions that she raises about narrative. Again, for me, the touchstone lines are, we tell ourselves stories in order to live, but then she almost immediately undercuts it in the next paragraph, which begins, or at least we do for a while. And so that balance, because I do believe in that firmly, we cannot survive without stories, without narrative. We're narrative making animals. We live in a universe of chaos in which there is no inherent meaning, and the only meaning that is built is the meaning we build by the stories we tell. Sorry, that's how I feel. And so
We're your people.
in the construction of the stories are absolutely necessary, right? But the stories ultimately desert us because they're not complete enough, or on the most basic level, we die. So nothing's going to save us. Stories won't save us. Nothing saves us. So there's that. It's all a big con in a certain way, but a necessary one. And I think that she kind of gets, increasingly sort of to explore that territory, which is deeply relevant and compelling to me. I also think that.
Wait a minute.
What?
Wait a minute.
No.
You just said some things really quick.
I know, because I'm trying to get to the part about
I
politics.
know, but it's
okay.
all a big con. We die anyway. This is the difference between a Jew and an Armenian.
Yeah.
Clearly, we just found the difference.
What I'm saying is nothing matters. It's really a French existentialist position. What I'm saying is that in an absurd universe, let's bring in Camus. In an absurd universe, or a universe with no identifiable meaning, right? The only meaning is the meaning that we construct. We can take that as a negative and say nothing matters, or we can take it as a positive and say what matters is that it matters to us, and the fact that everything is so evanescent, and the fact that we are going to disappear, and that all of these things we're building will disappear with us. It's all sand painting. Is what makes it so essential. It's a way of reaching out.
Well, we
in
know
some way.
ourselves and our world by the stories we tell.
Yeah.
We tell a story. I mean, we've lived through today.
Yeah.
What is the story of this day? What is the story of this time? And then, of course, for the artists, it is, how to craft all of that fodder and create something that speaks universally and beyond something.
No
right?
question. And we do. I mean, even if you think about it, I talk to my students about this all the time. We always tell ourselves, we do tell ourselves stories in order to live. We get up in the morning and say, here's what I'm going to do today. And we tell ourselves a story of what the day's going to look like. Now, it may or may not end up actually looking like that, but we tell ourselves that story. And that story helps to frame the day and allows us to move through it. So there's that.
Right.
I think the other way that she continues to be relevant is that, and I don't know, let's say her skepticism about received narratives, right? So in the case of the 60s stuff, part of the skepticism is about the received narratives of the counterculture, right? She's not undercutting the counterculture so much as questioning the pieties of the counterculture. And I think in terms of some of the other things, like she's one of the first reporters who really zeroed in on the fallacy of the Central Park jogger case, right? When she wrote about that. And that also was questioning a social narrative that was very prominent and very much in place in New York City at that time. Her tendency, her skepticism, and I think that that's always timely, but certainly uber timely in the current moment. And I think that since we are living through a period of dislocation and distrust and social upheaval in a lot of ways, her observation of a prior moment moment is valuable and relevant. Where I think there are issues, and there certainly are issues, have primarily to do with race and class. And I think that, I will say that I think one of the things I admire about her writing in regard to class, I don't think she's writing overtly about class, but writing from within class. But one of the things I admire about her writing in terms of class is that she makes no excuses, right? She makes no bones about her own privilege and position. She writes from out of that position of privilege because that's the position she occupies. And so there's something, I think, quite honest about that and interesting in terms of thinking about how do we as writers, or how do we as humans deal with those kind of questions. On the other side, however, with very few exceptions, Didion's California is almost entirely white. And, as all of us who live in California know, that's a pretty narrow slice of California. So I think she really is great at nailing that slice of California.
It's also a slice of California that's gone.
That's gone, right? It was but it was already going when she was writing about it. Now she did, it's not that she didn't know this stuff. She did, she was in Delano with her husband, John Gregory Dunn, when he was reporting on Chavez for the book he ended up writing about it, she helped him do the reporting. In fact, she was there as the local guide because he was from West Hartford and didn't know anything about the Central Valley or farming or any of it, right? California, big agriculture in California. So she knows this stuff, but in some ways, I think it's emblematic of how, I don't know another word for it, but maybe how segregated the state was in the 50s and 60s when she was coming up and starting to write about it, and her sensibility was being framed. I do think that when we talk about her as a California voice, that's a huge part of the California experience that is largely absent from her writing, and there's no way to talk about her writing without acknowledging that and addressing it. It's just it is.
Well, it's been
what is.
interesting to teach goodbye to all that.
Mm-hmm.
I've taught it now for at least 25 years, and how it would speak to people 25 years ago versus now.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of quibbling now.
Oh, a lot,
in
yeah.
terms of race and class, and gee, how bad was it being able to charge your dinner on your Bloomingdale's card? Boy, poor girl.
Right.
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 And so, but it's also a really interesting way. I was just thinking about this and thinking about tonight how differently we look at work. So much of how we look at work today, when everything is trying to readjust and the pendulum has swung so much in the other direction correctively,
Yeah.
in terms of what work feels most vital today.
Mm-hmm.
We look at the work even among developing writers. We look at it thematically much more than we did 25 years
No
ago.
question.
And the theme dominates all discussion. So it's even hard to get people to look at goodbye to all that and not say, yeah, but that's a rich white girl, like going through something, and sort of dismissively.
Right.
And I'm like, no, like, come back. Even if you reject something outright, even if it doesn't speak to you, take your humble self and learn from it, if nothing else, to push against it.
Mm-hmm.
And Didion gives us so much to push against.
No question.
So much to want and to emulate.
And I think that essay is really interesting for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons that essay is so interesting, I also teach it on occasion, and one of the reasons that essay is so interesting is going back to what you're saying at the beginning of this conversation, what gets left out.
What gets left out.
Right? Because what is that essay about? That essay is about essentially a breakdown of some kind, right? And an inability to function that results that has become so devastating that it results in her literally having to leave New York.
Having to get married
and leave New York, right? So, but the other thing that
what am I going to do? Oh, I'll get married.
I get married, move to Los Angeles.
It's like it's the oldest tale.
But the other thing that's really interesting about that essay is that during the time that all that was happening, she was also preparing Run River for publication, right? Run River comes out in 1963. She leaves New York in 1964. The breakdown that she's describing in Goodbye to All That is taking place concurrently. I don't hold this against the essay. I actually think this is a really great example about selectivity, right? Yes. The essay is an essay about the breakdown.
Well, and what it does when she so deftly marks all the moments, puts the breadcrumbs down, so we fill in, as I did when I was 23 reading it, we fill in with our emotion.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So the breakdown actually, and it's in a way the same device as at the end of Slouching Toward Bethlehem, where you see the kid on acid. She paints the entire picture. She can't speak.
Right.
But what it makes the reader do is lean in and bring the emotion.
Yep.
And she's totally knows what she's
no
doing.
Question.
I mean, there's just
no question. And it universalizes that moment, or both of those moments, but it universalizes the breakdown. Two things universalize breakdown moment. One is it's not completely clear what the breakdown is, right? Is there something really, really serious going on that requires intervention, or is it simply like an inability to function? And
Is it oh, I need an analyst 5 days a week kind of breakdown?
right, or do I need to be committed, right? Yeah, but
right.
you know, and we don't know, and actually I kind of think that's it's a great thing about the essay, because often we don't know if we're in that kind of situation anyway. It varies moment to moment, and secondly, it allows us to bring our own. Is it just someone who's like depressed and sad, or is it someone who's in real serious trouble? And so it brings us in. We can sort of implant our own stuff. The other thing too, again, is that the essay, and she's certainly choosing how she's building it. The essay is not, if she were to bring in, if she were to say like, oh, and then I was also like reading the page proofs of my first novel while all this was going on, it would destroy that sense. The claustrophobia of that essay is one of the most essential things. And one thing we can all say, I mean, I relate to that essay, deeply, because I've definitely had those moments where like I don't want to leave the house, I don't want to do anything. And maybe that's what she's going through in that essay. Maybe she's going through something more serious than that. But when you're in it, the only thing you're focusing on is the fact that I feel terrible and I can't get out of the house. It's like you may be sort of struggling your way through work, but it's not relevant to the story she's telling. And so I think that it's another example of her ruthlessness. She's ruthless towards her material as well, and she doesn't need to tell us everything, because she's telling us this thing, and she'll tell us the other thing maybe somewhere else, or maybe
piece.
in another piece, right?
She's saving it for another
exactly,
piece.
exactly.
Well, yeah, I'm suddenly like, how are we on time? Here we can talk forever. Oh my gosh, it's almost 8 o'clock.
Should we open questions?
I think we should.
What were you gonna say about politics?
Oh, I was just going to say that I think that she, again, I think it was what I was saying about the idea that her responding to or writing about the hypocrisies and contradictions of the political landscape she was living through is completely relevant in terms of the political landscape that we're living through. And I think that vision, that sensibility, that sort of trying to kind of find the line between a variety of untrustworthy sources is really useful.
Well, and also of the moment, I mean, here she was writing so much in this volume 1 is the 60s, and that sense that we're post-apocalyptic in the 60s. I mean, that sense of sort of the great days are over, that she really keens to and writes toward, and you realize, wow, if everybody felt that way in the 60s, what the hell are we, but we've been here before.
I once wrote an essay about, in part about this, and one of the things I talked about was, this was about 10 years ago, so one of the things that I talked about in the essay was this notion that in a world of narrative construction, right, where everything is constructed, where we can't rely on narratives anymore, so everybody's constructing their own narratives, you get Barack Obama on the one hand, which is a certain kind of constructed narrative, quite inspirational one, I think, and this is dating me because this is when I was writing it, and you get Sarah Palin on the other hand, who's another kind of constructed narrative, much less inspirational, I think, but nonetheless, they're, both of them couldn't exist without the 60s in some sense, partly because of cultural reaction, but partly because Palin always reminded me of the kid in Slouching Towards Bethlehem who wanted to hitchhike to New York, and Didion said to him, I don't know anyone who's driving to New York, but this guy's driving to Chicago. And the kid goes, yeah, I don't want to go to Chicago, I want to go to New York, with no knowledge of the fact that you got to go through Chicago to get to New York. That's like a perfect Sarah Palin moment in a way. Right now, 10 years later, we're in a territory where like Sarah Palin actually seems substantial and thoughtful on some levels,
Well, let's not go crazy.
Probably not that, but at least, right. Right, we would, but you know what I'm saying? So there is an idea that like we keep going.
You could argue Sarah Palin begat Trump.
Yeah, we keep going. We keep going further down the rabbit hole, and I think that there's a way that Didion. I'm not saying that this starts in the '60s, or that we weren't going down the rabbit hole in the '30s. We had Huey Long in the '30s.
Well, I mean, the point is we've been down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, we've been down the rabbit hole, but Didion starts kind of investigating it in a skeptical way, and I think that that's quite useful for us as a kind of guideline, because the world that she was describing, where there is no more shared narrative, that's another huge part of her sensibility. We are now living in a world where there is clearly no shared narrative, or certainly a culture, let's not say in a world, but in a culture where there is no shared narrative or even sense of shared narrative. If you're watching any of the hearings that are going on, what you're seeing are two completely incompatible worldviews.
Radios playing
Yeah.
at each other.
And there is no Venn diagram in which those worldviews come together. I think that she's kind of predictive of that in the way that she's looking at the culture of the 1960s, and that's another reason I think she's relevant. So that's the political part of it, I think.
I was thinking about her. Well, I've been listening to the hearings, and I started thinking about her. Like, oh, this is how I could maybe get through this kind of insanity. I mean, you know, like nobody. That's not right. That's not right. Each side was like contradicting itself in certain fundamental ways, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I was just going blank.
Well, I think much what we were saying, I mean, to your point, and I think we're all feeling it, is, and this is, I think, the thing to be written about, is in this moment where there are such polarized sides. What's happening is the body America is having to absorb that tension. We're the ones absorbing the emotions that are coming at. We're in the middle.
Yep.
And how that is transforming us day by day, we can't see yet. Someone has to see it, but we're not going to know. We're not going to know for years.
Yeah.
But it is. I think it is literally, physically, so on a cellular level, changing us.
Yeah, well, there's a reason that everybody I know has high blood pressure. And I think
and
Or
antidepressants, and drinking more,
yeah.
eating more
Right?
chocolate or whatever.
Right,
Yeah.
because when there's no agreed upon story. I mean, why do we create stories? Why do we tell stories? We tell stories to make sense of our lives, and to make sense of our and to put ourselves at the center of our lives.
No question. And stories,
as we live
and
them.
nations need stories as well as humans.
And there's no agreed upon. There's no agreed upon truth. There's no agreed upon character at the center.
Yeah.
That's a depressing
Which means
thought.
you have to think for yourself, right?
Well, that's hopefully the
your own way.
end result. I mean, that's always been the point. And again, I think that too is something that I think she embodies, right, in her work. She's thinking for herself. We may agree with her, we may disagree with her, but she is again, the character of Didion in the writing, and in the essays in particular, because that's where the thinking becomes action, is always thinking for herself against, in many ways, the received wisdom or the received ideas of the worlds that she's traveling in. And again, we can agree with it or disagree with it, but the thinking is a key aspect of
And she
of the
can't
work.
be other, and
Right.
that's really what I think in the canon of the great writers. When you're reading Tolstoy, when you're reading Baldwin, when you're reading Toni Morrison, everything Toni Morrison is, what she thinks, how her world, her body, even, it's right there in the work.
Yep.
And it's extraordinary.
Absolutely.
And that's certainly true of Didion.
No question. I think that's exactly right.
I can't believe she's still alive. Like when I was younger and I started reading, I think, oh my God, this woman's going to commit suicide by next year. We're going to read about her being. That's what I kept thinking, and she's still alive. At what, almost?
She's
90?
85.
Yeah, she's 85, and I always thought she was.
Didn't
Not
you
gonna
tell me
make it.
there's only one other? Who was the other writer? They always wait till the person's
This
found.
is the fourth.
Fourth?
The fourth. All the other ones are dead now, but this
Yeah.
is the fourth. Usually they wait until the writer has died. The
do
four
this.
four who were put into the Library of America while they were living. The first was Eudora Welty. The second was Bellow. The third was Roth, and then Didion's the fourth. And I don't know, Roth. All of the Roth work came out while he was alive. Bellow and Welty, I think, died in I think
While
they
it
published
was-
the
while it
first.
was coming
Yeah,
out.
I don't think everything had come out while they were alive. But she's the fourth living writer, or whatever
Who
that's.
will be the
whatever
fifth?
that's worth.
Did she help you with the projects at all?
A little bit. She signed off on me doing it, and then she gave me notes. it's a strange thing to call me the editor of this book, because it's not like I went in and was like, that sentence isn't very good, let's remove it. Or maybe you want to develop this scene a little bit more here. So that would have been fun. I would like to have seen what the reaction to that would have been. This is always
Goodbye to all that.
This has always bothered me about that. But so it was more of a curatorial project, and so my responsibility, which turned out to be really interesting. I mean, I shouldn't say turned out. I hoped it would be. Was I created a biographical timeline, and then I also did what I'm calling, they weren't textual notes, but I did like the contextual notes, where I read all the books again and marked all the things I thought needed explanation or might need explanation for a contemporary reader, or even all the names that got dropped. I was like, oh, who is that person? Who is that person I've never heard of that I just always kind of read over as I was reading, because it was part of the weather or the landscape of the piece of writing, but now I need to know, right? So Google quite useful for this sort of thing, and so that was the work I did, and she gave me notes on those, and
that's great.
that was great.
So you hung out with her?
You'd query her?
No, I wrote them, and then we sent them
Great.
to her, and she didn't give me a lot, but she gave me a few notes, and corrected some things, which was great, and so. That was her involvement. I think partly because it was all previously published work, and it's a kind of career retrospective rather than something that's involving new work. I think she was more content to let it just kind of take its course. But the notes were not only were the notes really helpful, but hey, Joan Didion gave me notes. That was really awesome. There is. I'm sure this is true for you too. There is still a kind of inner 15-year-old in me, maybe even 13-year-old. I actually usually talk about my inner 19-year-old, but he was a different character, who just really wanted to be a writer more than anything in the world. So you get an email with Joan Didion's notes, you're like, oh my God, this is great.
Yeah, I edited one of Alice Munro's last stories, and she didn't use email, so we had to go Pony Express back and forth. And I remember getting it, thinking, "Oh my God!" I was back being that kid. She sealed this envelope.
Yeah. No question.
She touched these pages.
Yeah.
What an incredible thing.
When I was editing the LA Times Book Review, I once commissioned a piece from Cynthia Ozick, and she also. Did she use email? I don't know. She wouldn't edit by email. So the edit was I got the piece, I made my notes, and I had to call her.
Oh God.
So we edited on the phone, and she was I knew her a bit, I've known her a bit, I like her, she's great. She was just a killer. She was so tough, and she wouldn't I was like, well, what about this? She shot down almost all of my edits. I was on the phone with her 2 hours going through this piece, and finally at the end she allowed me to I can't even remember now, I either inserted or removed a comma, and I was like, oh, victory. I have edited Cynthia Ozick. But it was that same kind of thing. I was like, I'm arguing with Cynthia Ozick over the punctuation of one of her sentences. It just doesn't get better than that,
No.
I think another way she's really relevant is, especially when you teach her amongst teenagers, just that questioning of adulthood and trying to find yourself in the world around you. I mean, I think that's one of the things I always respected about her, because I read her pretty young, was the fact that she was always trying to figure out who the adults were in the room, and trying to figure out what her voice would be.
And I think that's such a good point, because in Slouching Toward Bethlehem, I think some of her shock was that there weren't any adults in the room.
Right.
And you feel that actually without her ever mentioning it, just by where the point of view moves from here to here to here, you start feeling like, oh my God, there is no center.
Right.
There's
And I think that's a key part of her. There are often no adults in her work, right? I mean, the adults are just children masquerading as adults, and so everybody's left to figure it out for themselves. The other thing I quickly wanted to say, which we didn't talk about in terms of, I think it's not a kind of counter to the sort of privilege aspect of it, but I think it's also really important to remember about her that when she started doing this, particularly as a journalist, she was a woman doing serious reporting in a world that was I don't even want to say dominated by men. It was all
All
men,
men.
you know. And so there's something really interesting about. I mean, so in that way, I think she's groundbreaking in a lot of ways that we
Totally,
kind of take for
totally.
granted now because we're used to
And
it. But
she
she
did-
helped create
And
that
she
territory.
wasn't fey about it.
No.
She, you know, in that way of claiming her turf, claiming her authority in
Yeah.
the pieces. There's nothing shy about or developing
No,
about her.
not at all. Even the early, I mean,
even
even
the
going
early
back to the
stuff.
earliest
Right.
essays in the early 1960s, that voice is fairly developed. You can watch it develop in certain ways, but it's fairly developed. It's very accomplished. It's very confident, and it is seizing that space very much. Right? It's very
Yeah.
much seizing that space.
Yeah.
She moved away from women's magazines and into, I mean, again, she was a conservative, so into the National Review, and then, you know, was writing for Life, and, you know, but I think very consciously
The
was
big
like,
boys.
yeah, I don't want to be writing little personal essays, which was essentially what they had her doing for Vogue or Glamour or whatever. I want to be writing for, you know, the Saturday Evening Post. I want to be covering the counterculture. I want to go like they couldn't figure out how to do it because of the baby. I mean, they're nuts, but nuts in a kind of admirable way. Like, they wanted to go to Vietnam and report on the war, and they were seriously considering taking that baby to Vietnam. But they couldn't. It never quite worked out. But she wanted her piece of the big stories. She wanted to write about Manson. She wanted to write about Patty Hearst. She wanted her piece of the big stories of the moment, and made no bones about not trying to seize those stories. And I think that's also something that's really important about her.
Well said.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you for doing this.
Oh,
I think
thanks.
I think it's really.
I'm
It
delighted.
was so fun to dip back into.
It is available for purchase, and I will sign Joan Didion's name to it.
Well done.
Thank you all for coming.
And your book is for sale?
It is.
And by yes,
And
Carol.
I will sign it.
She'll sign Joan Didion's
I'll
name.
sign
to her
Joan
book.
Didion's name.
I'm gonna go grab a copy.
Oh, great.
I brought bookmarks if you wanna.
Oh, excellent.
We get the books up front.
I'll go grab some.
Yeah, I think that they're available.